All right, everybody, welcome for another episode of the Soccer Performance Podcast. We have our first professor and researcher on the podcast who also has years of real world experience working in Premier League clubs and clubs around Europe. So we have Liam Anderson. He's going to tell us more about his journey, and then we're going to get into a wide variety of topics. So Liam, thank you for coming on. Welcome. Pleasure to have you. If you don't mind introducing yourself and kind of give us a brief kind of timeline of your journey and where you've worked.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Juan, for the invite onto the podcast. So just to start off, really, like many young sports scientists, right? We started off wanting to work within professional sport and professional football. And I realized that very early on during my degree. So I was doing my undergraduate degree at Liverpool, John Moores University. And after the first year, when these lecturers were coming in and speaking to us and teaching us, and they were showing us that the work that they were actually doing within the football clubs and the research that they were doing in the football clubs, I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. Imagine being able to do the research on some of some of the best players in the world or some of the best players in the Premier League and things like that. So I realized during that degree program that I'm going to push for this. I'm going to really go for it. And unfortunately, I was unable to really get any hands-on experience during my undergraduate, but in year 3, I managed to get a placement working with Burnley Football Club. And that was basically going in and just doing some fitness tests on the players. And then that led then to another opportunity at Blackburn Rovers Football Club. Again, just going into the football club and doing some fitness tests on the players. And that was I'm going to call that my inroad, because I maximized that on my CV for whatever it was and the things that I did and the things that I produced from that. And that got me a year-long internship working with Everton Football Club whilst I underwent my master's. So that was really the start of my, I'm going to call it, professional journey, where I was working with an elite football club. After the first 2 weeks, I got invited up to the first team to work with the first team and stayed up there for the entire season. But what was beauty about that was it was really broad. Like it involved filming games, it involved taking hydration samples, it involved doing the GPS, which was relatively new at the football club at the time, taking warm-ups, taking conditioning sessions for the academy age groups, taking gym sessions for the academy age groups, filming academy games, coaching academy games, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And now, after that year, I was sort of in a little bit thinking, where should I go next? What should I do? And I got approached by one of the university lecturers that I built up a really good relationship with, someone that I'm still in a lot of close contact with today. And he asked me if I wanted to apply for a 3-year PhD working with Liverpool Football Club first team. Now, being a Liverpool fan myself, I was thinking, yeah, I'm going to go for this. I'm 100% going to go for this. This is what I've been waiting for. So I applied for it and got it, and I started the season later. I must apologize for my dog in the background, if you can hear that. So I started the season later, and I spent 3 years at Liverpool, and whilst I was studying for a PhD as well. And that was brilliant. It was a really eye-opening experience where we went out into a whole new environment, but it was literally top level. There was no shortcuts, nothing holding back. Everything was planned to the specific detail, and it really opened us like, okay, this is the pinnacle of football, and this is how it should be, right? And then after I finished at Liverpool, again, sort of in limbo, it was a 3-year contract working for a PhD. I was a little bit unsure of what I was going to do. So I got an offer to go out to Hungary and be the head of sports science and fitness at a first division team out in Hungary. I was there for 1 year. Unfortunately, didn't really work out for a few reasons. And then came back to the UK and got a role working relatively close to my house with Crewe Alexandra Football Club as the head of sports science and medicine. And I was there for around 4 years. Not long after that, I realized I needed a little bit of a change, and I wanted a little bit of a change, and I still wanted to keep an arm within football because that's where my passion was. But I went into the academic route. So first of all, I went in as a research fellow where I was working with Professor Barry Just, who was the guy who originally got me in somewhat 8 years earlier, working into Liverpool. So I was working with Barry on doing different types of research, writing different book chapters, trying to understand everything a little bit again after being out of the academic side for so long. And yeah, now I'm working at the University of Birmingham, where we work with different football clubs, different organizations, different stakeholders on applied projects such as applied PhDs, similar to how I was working when I was at Liverpool. And that's me from the start right the way through till now.
All right, so a lot in there. I'm sure Juan will think of some things he'll ask you. What I want to kind of get into is, well, one, I've like a research based question because you know there there's so much research done in football clubs in the UK, and in Canada they have nothing like that. In America, not really either. It was eye opening to me when I went there how there's so much research going on in clubs and so much data being produced, and that's how people inform their training and so forth. Where in Canada they inform their training on nothing, pretty much, on just with their coach. So I mean, it was eye opening for me. So before we get into like the fun questions about the clubs and all that, and kind of the different levels of training, kind of what is what answers are you still looking for, and what research kind of questions are your PhD students pursuing, and what are you guys trying to figure out, if there's, because for me at least, I'm not sure where it's headed.
Yeah, so I've got really probably two key areas which have different branches that come off my research area. And one of the areas that I'm really interested in is like the management of people and how different departments work together. And that's something that we're doing with another Premier League football club who's looking at trying to define what is high performance and what is defined as high performance to some key stakeholders within the club. And then we've also got another arm coming off that with adaptation and how can we try to maximize the adaptation. And I think before you need to maximize the adaptation, you need to understand the demands. And even though the demands of football or soccer have been studied extensively now for almost 50 years, we've still only really been looking at the same variables. We've never looked at other variables, and now new technologies come into place, right? And we can now track players for every turn they make on the pitch. But my research area is really looking around now. Okay, players change direction. They change direction a lot. It's a significant demand on them. First of all, what does it look like in match play? Then let's regress it back. Okay, what does it look like in match play? What is the physiological response to that in terms of, is it increased heart rate? Is it increased lactate? Is it increased soreness? Etc., etc. But then also, what's the physiological response for that after a bout of exercise? So if someone does a straight line bout of exercise versus a change of direction bout of exercise, and this is putting it in its simplest terms, right? But if you all think about different types of training sessions, some which are more straight lines, some which are more, it's probably multi-directional, especially in pre-season, that might happen. And then trying to understand what actually happens within the muscle and also more basic physiology wise, because there's been some research out there that's looked at 180-degree change of direction, work matched acceleration, deacceleration. So same distance, same acceleration, same decelerations. One group has worked linearly and the others worked but changed direction 180 degrees every time. And the actual response within the muscle was different in the change direction than the straight line one. So there's clearly something happening within the muscle, right? And it might actually add on an extra layer to exercise prescription. And there's new technology out there now that can start to really quantify that. So that's what my real interest in the research within soccer is, really, Mario.
Okay. So a lot there in adaptation, and a topic we've spoken about and that you've taught me a lot back in the day: adaptation versus recovery, and how we kind of look at that in a week. Um, can you kind of simply break down, well, one, how do we say? Okay, what is adaptation? Okay, so for those listening at home, let's say players and coaches back home, when you say adaptation, what do you mean, and what's that training look like? And how is that different from recovery? And then can we go on? How do we optimize recovery? Um, and what would that kind of look like in a training week? Um,
So,
that makes
so I think
sense.
it's yeah, yeah. So I think it's first of all, let's look at what the stress is, and the stress ultimately elicits an element of fatigue, right? And that element of fatigue will then come up and go above normal levels. So you'll probably get some super compensation. But that period until you go into that super compensation is like a recovery period. And if you're putting another stimulus in or a different or the same type of stimulus within that recovery period, then it's unlikely that they're going to get those adaptations. They'll probably actually get maladaptations and they'll actually get worse within their fitness or they become injured. It's about getting it at the right time. So players or athletes are being stimulated at the right time in order to constantly get that super compensation to continually improve. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then now let's, in terms of recovery, okay, they had a hard training session. Let's say post match, Saturday match day. You were head of sports science medicine for years. How do you want your team to recover? What does that look like from when they get off the pitch to, let's say, even up to Monday afterwards? Like, what are you looking at? What step by step kind of.
So I think with that, it all depends on what the upcoming load is. So, for example, if they're playing on a Saturday and Monday's training session is going to be an easy training session, and Tuesday's training session it's going to be in the afternoon or it's going to be a little bit later, then it's more than likely if you've got the right playing squad, and I mean the right playing squad, people that tend to recover on normal levels, then by the time it gets to that Tuesday training session, they're probably already recovered naturally. So there might not be any need to put in different recovery protocols. And when I say recovery protocols, I mean things like cold water immersion, cryotherapy chambers, any sorts of stuff that's going to augment the recovery process. So there might not actually be a requirement for that. So we might actually benefit more from the inflammation. But then if there's a game on the Tuesday, right, and the training on the Monday, and training's about preparing for the game on the Tuesday, then there's clearly a need, and it's such a short period that we need to accelerate the recovery during that period. And I think recovery comes from a few things. It comes from, well, you've got the modalities that are not like sort of natural. So you've got sleep, nutrition, which I think has to come after every training session and match. You've got modalities such as foam rolling, stretching, massage. Then you've got things like ice baths, cryotherapy, heated therapy, etc., etc. So it's all about how you use those different therapies or those different approaches. But probably if you think of it like a pyramid, and you've got sort of ice baths on the top, massage, etc., etc., but then sleep and nutrition on the bottom. And without getting the sleep and nutrition right, there's probably no point in doing the stuff on the top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Does
so
that
that's a
make
big
sense?
one. Yeah, so that's a big one, and I'm glad you said that, because I know everyone's going to look at on Instagram what tool to use, what stretch is the best, what mobility routine, but they they eat like crap. They're not getting the sleep. So basically, you summarize: get the food and sleep right first. Otherwise, there's no point to doing everything else. And that's kind of what I've always seen, what I felt even in my own training and whatever. So I'm glad you touched on that. Before we move on, Juan, any questions there?
No, I like the way that point kind of concluded, because too many young players especially are always trying to look for the I guess the the cherry on top rather than doing the day to day. And it's just a good way to summarize that. You can't be worrying about, an ice bath or a sauna session and be getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep. So this is just a good point for young players that. And I was actually going to ask you that, Liam. I was going to ask you that, how do you rank these methods of modality, and where does sleep and nutrition lie? But you covered that, and so I think it's such a good takeaway for young players, and it's a message that keeps being repeated from guest to guest. But there's so many things you can do on your own before you even contemplate all these other special methodologies. So I like the way that you put that.
Yeah, and it's also like a recovery pyramid, I think, Juan.
For sure.
So it's sort of with the sleep and nutrition at the bottom of that pyramid, and as you go up towards the top, probably massage at the top, ice bath, cold water, any sort of cold therapy, and then probably foam rolling and stretching just above that.
Let me ask you something really quick before we move on. Outside of obviously the priority lies with sleep and nutrition, but where do you scale, or where do you give value to the other modalities, and when it is appropriate? I know we could probably go on forever, but briefly speaking, how do you manage, ice load, sauna load, foam rolling load? What would you suggest?
So I think everyone has a different one, so we could be here a while, right? But I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
And I think when you're thinking about ice baths after games, and I've worked with players before, right, they've got an ice bath after every training session, every game. Now, I personally don't think that is the right thing to do, because we need some sort of inflammation within the muscle, right, in order to get that adaptation. If we're constantly just dampening that adaptation, then we're missing out on things. And there's been some research that's now it's looking at different adaptive responses after training sessions that are actually it's dampened the the sort of molecular responses to training when you actually get an ice bath. So for me, it's about looking, okay, we've had a big stimulus. It's going to cause a lot of physical stress and fatigue on players. When is the next upcoming stimulus, which is going to further fatigue players? Is it within 72 hours? If it is, we need an ice bath, for example. But then, that said, I also think that these sort of recovery strategies, right, need to be periodized over the season as well. So players can't become used to doing this. And I'll use the analogy of a coffee, right? So say you don't drink coffee, you want, but I do, right? We both go and have the same cup of coffee from Starbucks. And then I'm going to react differently to that coffee than you are, because I'm used to drinking coffee. I usually have 4 or 5 cups a day, but you have none. You're going to react differently. And I think it's the same thing physiologically, right? From recovery strategies and ice baths. If we always do it, and we always do it after training, after matches, then when we really need it, we actually don't see the benefits from it.
Fair. That's a very good point. Never thought of it like that. Now, would you say that the adaptation comes from what? Is it tolerance to cold, or where does the adaptation? How do you increase? Like, does somebody now, like, comes you can't increase the temperature. Do you increase the use? I'm just trying to guide it. I mean, obviously, it's very easy for a professional player who would be told by somebody who's a professional like you what to do, but somebody at home trying to figure it out, if they could have a general guideline, where does ice baths and these things kind of play a role? Because I know that people want to dabble, and I just don't like when there's no guidance. Right? It'd be nice to give a tip to young players.
Yeah, and it's difficult to give that guidance without working with the individual or knowing the sport or knowing the demands and things. But I would typically look at like the highest demand of the week. So what is the highest demand of the week? When is the next upcoming, I'm going to call it significant load, but that could be anything, right? And then to think, okay, if that is within a period of time where I don't think I'll be able to recover from, then I think this is now an option, right? Where I need to get in an ice bath, or I need to do recovery modality X or Y.
Awesome.
Well, I have a question. So, so we touched on the perspective of recovery and preparing for let's say that Monday's a light day and this and that. I feel as though let's say younger players who are in the developmental category, right? They're 14, 15, 16, right? They're still developing. They're not uh, yeah, they're competitive, but they need to be training and developing still. Um, I feel as though there's a different perspective there with recovery and training. Because would you say that those players need to push harder? Like they don't get as many light days, you can say, as they need to push, they need to develop and stuff. If you catch what I'm saying, because for example, let's say that Saturday match day, you know, can they go hard again on the Monday? Do they really need to recover? Because I don't want those young players getting in that like first team mindset where it's always just performance, 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 if that makes sense.
I think it's important to clarify that this is for the assumption that you're playing 90 minutes, at a very high
Yeah.
intensity game, right? So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I thought that I know where you're going there. It's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've had this conversation with many, I'm going to call them academy staff, really. And you're probably looking at this from under 18s down. And for the life of me, I don't understand why academy members of staff have pre-seasons. And I get that we need to show players and put players through this at different points in the year. But I think that players within academy settings can probably have numerous pre-seasons throughout a season in order to augment those adaptations. Because if an under 18 or an under 16 or an under 14 shows up on a Saturday and he or she are slightly fatigued, is that really a big deal? Or does it just make them learn how to play when they're fatigued? Or do they just get used to playing and then adapt differently? Obviously, there has to be a certain extent, right, where we can't allow them to drop into overload and that they eventually get too fatigued and probably get injured, right? Because they're obviously developing athletes and numerous different things are going on within their body. But I actually think that they can undertake, let's have a 2-week block now where the load is going to be significantly increased from what a typical week is. And that's a probably better way how to get them to build them up rather than saying, okay, we've got 6 weeks at the start of the season or 8 weeks at the start of the season. Let's plow them with, 30, 40K weeks because this is the only time we've got to get them fit. Whereas in fact, you've got a full 10-month period to get these players fit.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I like that. Yeah, go ahead, Juan.
No, I think it's important to differentiate the fact that youth players are not peaking for a specific part of the season, right? And if you're doing a preseason, it might be because you were on holidays, but it's so important. And we've had previous guests talk about that. It's if you're a youth athlete, you are in season all season, and your goal is development. So, like you said, if you're showing up to a game a little bit fatigued, now you got to use your judgment. And if it's an important game and you think it's better to show up obviously fully rejuvenated. But if you're a youth player, you most likely are not just playing one game a week, or at least you shouldn't.
Yep.
So I think it's important to make sure that even though we're giving young players some guidance with recovery and whatnot, the priority is still development. And don't my 2 cents is just not to focus too much on the details and focus more on the things that are controllable. If you're a young player and you want to address recovery, sleep properly, eat properly, right? I think it's a good a measure to at least summarize that to a young player.
Yeah, so I've even had conversations with people in the past, and they say that their under 14 team follows the same. I don't know if this term the same thing in Canada, but tactical periodization as the first team. And it's like, well, why? Because it's obviously to allow multiple peaks throughout the season. If that was me with an under 14 team, I would sooner go, okay, let's have 2 weeks of endurance training for football, and then we'll have 2 weeks of whatever they call it within the tactical periodization, but potentially strength training for within football, maybe even longer periods, right? It'd probably take a little bit of time. I've never worked within the youth setup, but it would take a little bit of time to see what worked and monitor what worked.
That's good. I like the sound of that. Like throughout the season, periodizing throughout the year, rather than the first team periodization of just like week to week microcycles, just surviving and just trying to be fresh all the
Yeah.
time. I think that really hits home. I hope that hits home for anyone at home listening to this, about, can they structure and periodize their year better, where, these few weeks are focusing a little bit more on the endurance side, and then they transition into a little more, let's say, power and explosive type of things. So I think that's really good insight. Question: in terms of football culture, do you feel that, and maybe where, that there is too much emphasis on recovery, where they and not enough on the actual training in terms of pushing for adaptation, in terms of pushing the players to get to a higher level? Do you feel there's too much recovery? Because going through preseasons with you, I know you're maximizing that preseason. You're getting adaptation. You're really going for it, and then the players bounce from that preseason after they recover like they're flying. And yeah, so what do you think
So
there?
I think, and this isn't, you see a lot of times, right? And you see, oh, player X went in the ice bath, or player X did this recovery modality. How long do they do it for? Around 7 minutes, 5 minutes, or etc., right? Or they might have jumped and got a massage because they prefer to get a massage. So, and then there's the training, right? And I think it's two things. So I think the training could potentially be more aggressive, which, as you've seen, right, was at some stages throughout pre-seasons, which I did, was quite aggressive. And then the recovery can also be more aggressive, if you get what I mean by that. So instead of a little bit of a laxed approach where, oh, go and jump in the ice bath after training, boys. How long for? What temperatures it need to be at? So forth, so forth, so forth. Then come out, then we're going to do a foam roll. We've got a soft tissue therapist in. Here's a meal to take home with you after you've already had food after training. Take this meal home with you. This is the type of food you should be eating this evening. Make sure you get, you're in bed for 11 o'clock because you're back in tomorrow at 9, etc., etc., etc. So I think it's more about being more aggressive with both aspects of those things in order to increase adaptations long term, right?
That makes sense. And I think that brings some insight based on what we were talking before for the that youth player. If we're pushing develop, so in Liam, in Canada, it's a bit different, right? They don't get as much, like in a youth football club, they're in almost, they're in not every day, but 4 days a week. They'll even have a gym session and a pitch session. Where we're from, it's not really, like that. They don't get as much time. So we always promote players to go and train and do other stuff. And on the topic of maximizing development, so train hard and recover hard, I think that's good insight for them, because they have no choice if they want to play at a higher level and maximize that development. And if they are, a little tired this day and that day, so be it. They'll get, within reason, back off when you need to. But, players in Canada, and we've had other guests talk about this, are not pushing themselves enough. But so I think that brings really good insight there. That's really good. Juan, anything?
No, I think, and this is a great point for coaches. I know, we have some coaches that tune in, and youth coaches specifically here. I think it's important that coaches don't, or youth coaches, because we all do it, right? We're all looking and searching up whatever professional team that we like and seeing what they do. And then, you match your U14 team, let's say, periodic approach to Liverpool or to Chelsea or whatever, right? And you're using the wrong guidelines. And I think it's important for coaches, especially youth coaches, to understand that your goal has to be development at those ages and not peaking for a specific tournament or a specific game. Because at a youth level, if you have a tournament this weekend and the tournament the following weekend and then a showcase the weekend after that, it's very difficult to prioritize a specific tournament or a specific season, or to say, you know, there's going to be a scout at this game. You can't do that. So you have to be in a lens of development, and be honest to that, and not necessarily dictate what you do just to hopefully get a result at U12. And it's the biggest thing here that I find is a huge issue in Canada. The fact that the development really never moves up, the development never really gets more difficult, right? There isn't any addition to the training, like you're saying. It's just a constant line. There is no peak, there is no drop. And I find that the players show that in Canada. It's a very average line. And it's very difficult to see players exceed when they're not being pushed. And I think as coaches, we have the responsibility, especially with youth athletes, to push them. And so it's nice to give a little bit more guidance. So I hope that some coaches get great value from what we're talking about right now.
Liam, so obviously, so you spent 3 years in Liverpool, one of the biggest clubs in the world, and you spent times with other clubs in England, you know, at various levels, and even in Hungary. What is the difference between, you know, a top club like Liverpool, the day-to-day approach, how are things done there differently at that level? What makes it that level so much better in terms of preparation and everything versus what you might see at let's say a lower division club? Or it would be interesting to see it here also in like other parts of Europe, like Hungary, let's say, where, you know, where the level is not as high. Now, of course, Liverpool has the biggest budget, and, you know, they could buy all the best players and all, but, you know, are there some big differences that you can touch on?
Yeah, so I think, well, like, let's think about it. Let's take it back, right? And if you've arguably got a manager and coaching staff that, you know, everyone's got a bag of balls, 20 players for a training session, some cones and goals. Like that training session could be the same training session at Liverpool, at Everton, at Crewe, and at Malta-Haver in Hungary, right? That training session could be exactly the same. It could be planned the same, all the durations could be the same. But I think what changes those different training sessions is probably the players that are within them. And that's probably the difference, I think. And I thought about this a lot when I went from Liverpool to Hungary, because I was watching some of the players and I was thinking, you know, technically, really good, physically, really good, but it was the speed of thought that was actually probably the part that was lacking. So even though they're good technically, they take an extra half a second to get the ball out their feet. They take an extra half a second to go past the player because they're not quite thinking yet that that's what they need to do. So that's from a training standpoint. So I think that's the difference really between training. Anyone can put on the same training session, right, within whatever club they are in the world. But it needs to be suited towards the players that you have. So it doesn't really matter if, like, there's obviously differences from each club and differences from each manager's philosophy. But it needs to be suited to the, number one, the playing demands of the manager, and then the players that you have within your squad. And I think that's why some managers, right, they come up to the Premier League and they implement their style of play and philosophy in their training session, and they perhaps don't have a real good success. And that's probably because the level of players that they're working with is a lot higher than what they've been working with in the past. So those types of training sessions might be easy for them. It might be not really challenging, and so forth and so forth. And then the next thing is things like facilities and support that the players have around them. So, you know, Liverpool have just moved into a multi-million-pound brand new training centre in the north of Liverpool. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's got everything you can possibly want. Top level catering facilities, top level recovery facilities, everything that they could possibly need in there. But then you go to a club like Crewe, who are in the it's like the fourth division in England, but League Two. You go to their club, and they've got a nice, like an okay gym. It's quite dated, not really done much to. The football pitches are a little bit, I'm going to say, rugged, not really being cared for. We use wheelie bins, didn't we, Mario, as ice baths instead of actually having an ice bath. So then we had to get ice in and try to get it to a right temperature, etc., etc. All these things obviously make an impact on what develops the player, right?
Mm-hmm. So obviously, yeah, a big budget is definitely important. Obviously, there.
Yeah, the big budget, but also the right people there implementing things as well.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because you touched on, and I see this even in strength and conditioning. Let's say in the gym, on the pitch, whatever. You could probably recall same session carried out by different people, different results. How you execute everything, how you implement it, how it's coached, big difference. And so that's why players at home, they're always looking, I want this program on the sheet. I'm looking, what should I do? They're looking up, what training session they should do by themselves, and they just see what and read whatever. But it's how it's executed which is so important. And like you said, that difference, like that, playing that half a second faster makes all the difference. And that could be demand from the coaches, that could be the competition from the players around you, and also the difficulty of session that the coach brings. And I know, like, Juan and I are big on that, because and that's something Juan always tries to do in his sessions. He has his own training facility in our hometown, but in Canada, coaches don't fully understand that. Yeah. Juan, and anything there, and any questions, Juan? So.
Yeah, no, I love the fact that you kind of touch upon, like, I was just thinking and I was just writing notes as you guys were kind of discussing that. But I think it's so interesting what actually makes, let's say, a $50 million player versus a $1 million player, or just how you actually measure the value of a player. And I guess the delusion of players that think they have the level to play at these top tier clubs. And like you said, I see it too. I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with some very high level players, Canadian players, and it's always the same the same issues, that the speed of play and the speed of thought, I think, all comes from your ability to manipulate the ball. If you have a difficult time manipulating the ball, it's impossible for you to have a fast thought process. And you may, but then you see the players that stumble and lose the ball. And so it's so interesting from your perspective that, and I do believe that. I was going to ask you that. What makes a striker for Liverpool versus a striker for a fourth division club? And I think it's so important that you said that the speed of play, the small details that then, if you shave it back, come back down to a high level of technique and a high level of movement literacy. So I just wanted to ask you really quickly, because we'll stay on the topic of Liverpool. What beyond the technical ability, what is the selection, and what is the process behind, we're going to go for this guy, we're going to spend all this money on this guy? Beyond it, is it a cultural thing? Is it a mentality? Because I was hearing some things about Klopp and Liverpool and how each player kind of resembles the philosophy of the club, that the philosophy of the people. So I just wondered if you can talk briefly about that on a cultural and on a mental side. What makes these top players top players?
So I can only really speak about from that, because when they're signed, really. And I think it probably just links into like the competitiveness that's within these players. So I've genuinely seen players before that, they've won. Have they won it? No, I don't think they have. They were high up within the list within the Ballon d'Or, right? They've gone on probably one of the best strikers in the world for the past 15 years. And you speak to them and you watch what they do and you understand things, and And it goes against everything what sports scientists probably tell you, right? Which I probably shouldn't really be putting on a podcast, but it just goes to show you that it must be something else, that that's the reason why they are who they are. So we did some dietary analysis on one of these players who was, again, one of the top players in the world at the time. And if it was before a 3 p.m. game, they didn't have anything to eat of the day of a game. Nothing at all. If it was any game after 5:30, they'd have 2 pieces of toast with jam, I think, on. Right? You then start looking at the training. Never get an ice bath. Never want to recover. Never want to do anything like that. Never want to foam roll. When it's leg day or lower body day within the gym, you ask them, come on, it's lower body day within the gym, and they don't go in the gym. Right? And you're thinking, how is this guy so good? How is he so good? But then within that small part of the day where he's got a ball at his feet on the football pitch, he's probably the most intense person you could ever meet, the most competitive person you could ever meet, the most desire that you could ever meet. And just because he didn't go to the gym and lift resistance training weights, his legs were probably the biggest legs on the football pitch as well, in terms of hypertrophy. And you're thinking, you must do something at home. You must do. But they don't, right? And there has to be something else within those players, right? Which I don't really know what it is in order to get there.
So how much of that then can you control? And so I guess it's a two-parted question. If that's the case, then there's a large area of success that is really in the mind, right? In the brain. It's in your desire and your thought. Yesterday I reposted something on my page that I can't remember what pundit was talking after a match, but they were saying on social media you see all the specific skills and tricks and do this modality to recover and eat this for whatever energy, but it comes down to the actual love for the game, love to compete, love to win. And I think that it's a good takeaway for young players to realize that, yes, of course, we're giving you insight on details, but if you don't have that natural urge to win and to really play at a high level, and that's something that you got to do sitting on at the edge of the bed looking in the mirror. But all these things are great. If you're really truly lacking that drive and that competitiveness, doesn't matter what modality, what training, I think you have a bigger battle to climb if that's the case. Mayor, what would you think?
No, that's really interesting. And I know, let's say you and I, Juan, we have that battle all the time. A player, let's say, might say, oh, well, this player doesn't do this type of training, or this player doesn't go to the gym, or that. And they may misguide that as, they don't have to, but are they, if any player at home wants to use that excuse, ask yourself, are you as intense as that person on the pitch? Are you 10 out of 10? Bringing it mentally every time? And are you anywhere near as talented, right? If the answer is no to one of those or both of those, then, no excuse. That's my opinion. But yeah.
I think with that as well, though, right? Like, even though those players, perhaps that I'm going to say they defy sports science a little bit, that we don't understand their full potential and what their potential could have been. Potentially, right?
Yeah,
that's a good point.
It's not to say that Iniesta, under a little bit more strength training, would have been a bigger beast, But I think there's a lot of players, especially here, and I think Canada and North American culture shifts the attention to that. Because culturally we're not on the ball as much, and you're not getting street games or games, recreational games between friends, like I think European players do or South American players do, just by the culture where they're from. And so naturally there's a shift to the physical side. It's like, okay, if I can't control the technical side because of my exposure, then I guess I'll just go hard in the gym. But then you get into that rarely do you go through the history of footballers and remember how strong this guy was. You remember how it's just it's not the nature of the game. And so I just head home with the message to young players: clean up your footwork, clean up your technical abilities. Everything else will fall smoothly if you have a good technical foundation. But Mayor, anything just to wrap up the episode?
I have one more question before we go on the topic of quality training. Let's say, because quality and intensity of training, and an example, people always talk about like Klopp teams, his methodology and this stuff. It's like how intense they play, the high tempo, the high press. For a team like that, I just want to, how does like I know there's a lot of fitness. They do a lot of fitness testing and prescribing based on that. But what would what's that training session like to play at that tempo? Like it must be very, very demanding. I was wondering if Liam, you had any insight on like getting a team. We have this style of play we want to match. We have these demands, very, very high demands. I mean, how do coaches? It might be a tough question, but like, what is that kind of looking like in that approach to like bring players up to that level, because it's very, very demanding.
So essentially, all that is, Mario, is which energy system are you predominantly using during either match play or training, right? And then training that energy system accordingly, right? So if you're a team that play on the counter attack and you're scoring goals on the counter attack, but you never train the anaerobic energy system, then you're probably going to be caught before you score, right? But then also to repeatedly press, you need that sort of high intensity aerobic energy system as well. So it's like, how do you mix all that in within different drills? And I've seen numerous things which happen, right? And a lot of the time within all the conditioning work that players do is purely aerobic work, but then the football is purely anaerobic work, because the anaerobic work is when games are typically won. So to do that without the ball might be seen as counterproductive. So the games are either won and lost really with anaerobic moments. And we know that from like where the passages of play where goals are scored. So they're scored in two elements at a time, right? Either a straight line sprint or a change of direction. So that we know that this energy system is important. So we train with the ball when we're trying to defend and attack them. And then we train the aerobic energy system through conditioning work in pre-season, for example, or at various points within the season. And then with that, the other stuff sort of take care of itself in small-sided games, in patterns of play, where people have to repeatedly press. As long as the work to rest and things like that are right, then people are going to get adaptations that way.
That's really good. Cool. With that, I think that's a really good kind of topic to finish on. We went a good length. We don't want to take up more of your time, Liam, but we really appreciate you coming on and sharing, and you bring a lot of unique experience and insight at the different levels you've worked at, and especially now as a researcher. So thank you very much for coming on, and Juan, anything to wrap up there?
Again, thank you so much for taking the time. I mean, hopefully players take a pen and paper and get studying. I think you got to take it upon yourself. If you're a youth coach, if you're a youth player, and I know our main demographic is Canada, we just want to grow the game. And again, thank you for giving us this insight. Players, free, go do your work.
Absolutely no problem. It was a pleasure. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, Twitter is probably usually one of the best things to get in touch with me on. If you want to put my handle, I don't know my handle, what it is, to be honest.
I will find it. I will find it in the description, and I'll put it in.
You want to put it in the comments or something?
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you again, and we hope to have you back again for another chat in the future.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Mario.
Cool. Thank you, Liam. All the best.
All right, boys. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening.